Quite a while back now, I made a video about Edd N Eddy that also drew on Neil Gaiman's masterclass to make a point that when creating characters, writers can often think a little too much about the backstory and not quite enough about the voice and how each character uniquely expresses themselves. Backstory is, of course, important, but it's not strictly character. In the same way a palette of paints is just a palette of paints until you create something with them. Backstory is something to inform a character's behaviour rather than behaviour itself. But I thought I'd make a follow-up video on that because when I sit down and look back at the way I create characters, I realise there's something else important that I failed to mention, which is the dynamics. I mean, I've said before that a person is never a fixed person with fixed behaviour. We're all always changing and adapting, which of course means characters need character arcs and development, but it also means they'll show different sides of themselves depending on who they're interacting with, to an extent. As I've said, this very calm sounding me you get on YouTube is different to the more chaotic me my friends know, for example. If I took Edd and Eddy as a quick example again, I could say they all do have their general characters. However, Eddy takes up a position to boss his two friends about quite easily, where he has to scheme much more of other people, and he's often kind of resentful and rolling his eyes at Double D's goody-goody side, where the way he employs Edd like a workhorse is kind of a mutual enjoyment for both Edd, who finds the jobs fun, and Eddy, who finds it funny to see Edd pulling wagons about of his teeth or whatever. You know, these are just the small things in the cartoon, but you get the idea. They each have different opinions and therefore different approaches to each other character. Eddy is nervous around Naz, rivalrous around Kevin, domineering in a kind of manipulative way around Jimmy, and kind of Johnny to an extent, angry around Sarah, baffled by Rolf, and afraid yet trying his best to act fearless around the Kanker sisters. It's a big part of how I plan my own characters in stories. I mean, the importance of this does depend on the sort of story you're writing, obviously, but I just think you want, lots of different opinions and little conflicts or differing perspectives on each other to give the world more dimensions, but also there are times where two characters will have to have one-to-one conversations, and you want to make their conversation with each other sounds different to a conversation between another two characters in some small way. I guess without that, no matter how fleshed out their personality and behaviours are, if they don't adapt a little bit, depending on who they're talking to, then you've just got a book full of people walking around shouting their personality at brick walls. I guess I'm saying it's not just who we are that defines us so much as how we interact with the things that aren't us, if that makes sense. I'll tell you how I come up with characters though, which obviously isn't the right way, it's just the way I do it. That might not be right for you, it might not even be right for me. Who's to say I don't develop a better way of doing this in the future? And also kind of, who am I to give advice? I always feel a bit uncomfortable making these sort of writing videos when I myself am actually yet to publish. So yeah, there's my disclaimer. Like with all my videos, I guess, keep in mind I might not know what I'm talking about. So let's assume by the time I've come to creating characters that I've already got a premise for the story, even if it's still kind of vague and even if I don't know the ending or whatever. Let's assume I've done that and say I'd then start, as any sensible person probably would, with the main character. What I don't do is get one of those checklists that people use with like a million character questions to answer about this person. I don't like that. Instead, I'll grab a random scrap of A4 paper, because my organisation is chaotic, and I'll just scribble my first loose thoughts about this person. I like taking a bit of blank paper to scribble whatever on, because it's less limiting that way. It gives more space for creativity, I think. I mean, it is very daunting to look at a blank page and think, God, I don't know who the hell this character is. Where do I start? But I think it's still good to start there rather than finding some limiting approach to guide you in a different direction to what your creativity might be. You know what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say it is daunting, but it's also good to have that freedom to begin with, and I start with the things I do know, which is normally something very, very small, that first idea you've vaguely got about this character. Like, take this random scrap of paper as an example I have from a character in a side project I may disclose to you at a later date. But the first thing I've written on one of the characters is literally just, boy, really good at art. The advantage of planning this way first is that I write that on a bit of paper and it immediately gives me an idea for something else, and because there's space on the page I can now just add a little line coming off of that and then write, classmates always ask him to draw their art homework for them, which is a very small thing, but something I might not have ever thought of if I was filling in some character checklist or thinking in more clear, linear ways about coming up with this character. So yeah, I write whatever vague thoughts come to mind, sometimes crossing them out, all in a complete mess that gets really hard to read. But the more I add, the more I start to get a sense of this person, and it slowly becomes less daunting and more easy as I go along. And you know, at some point, other characters, ones I've probably not even thought of before, get mentioned here on this sheet of paper. Like it says on this sheet, parents split up, lives with mum and her boyfriend he doesn't like. You know, so then I can just draw a line off this and think, why doesn't he like mum's new boyfriend? Is he a bit of a dick? Is he, I don't know, trying super hard to get the main character to like him and he finds that uncomfortable? What sort of ways does he go about trying to get the main character to like him? Why? What does the main character think of that? And, you know, I can jot those kind of things down there. These are just things that might get scrapped or changed later on, but I just keep going with that, you know. And then his best friend randomly pops up on the sheet, and a mention of how they get on or how they're different, which expands into their dynamic and then into some sort of conflict that might just naturally have between them. And then I can wonder if that's a conflict to resolve in the plot of the story, if it's a thematic point I can weave in, or if it's not. But if it is, how could it be resolved? And I can jot that sort of thing down. And at some point I probably wonder as well, what does this character want in the story? I mean, I might not, depending on the character, but definitely with the main character. What does he want? Not just in a logical sense of his aim, but emotionally. What's he after? What's his drive? So I try to jot some ideas of that. It's all just still this sprawling mess on a sheet of A4 paper, and, you know, no order or great worry about it. I just lie back and have a think and scribble down whatever random ideas I get about this character. I don't worry in this stage. But once I've done all that for all the important characters, I go back to the first sheet of paper that the first character was on, and I flip it over and I write out all the names of the other important characters with space between each of them, and then I just try to scribble down, what does this first character think of each of them? And this step can be really easy because you've had ideas about each of these other characters floating around your mind already through the sprawling mess. So you'll be fairly clear on how they feel about each other already a lot of the time. Other times it is very difficult and a real drag, but the thing about this step is it never necessarily has to be anything big or complicated. It's not like every character needs groundbreaking opinions on each other. A lot of the time it's just very simple points I write here. For example, this bit of paper I was talking about before, on the back of that it says about his best friend thinks he cares too much about status, and then in turn his friend about him thinks would be a bit of a loner if it weren't for me, needs to be more confident. Just that as one point, which could possibly lead to an important conflict in the story, or it could just be a nice dynamic to play out in the background. It depends. But there's a sense of dynamic here. One's the more confident character who's relentlessly trying to push the other one to come out of his shell, who's relentlessly resisting it, either because he doesn't give a damn about being popular or because it scares him. Probably a bit of both. But it's a dynamic, it's chemistry of some sort. It's pretty vague, yes, but if you get a couple of points like this, for me that's often enough to get started with writing. Like, I don't like to set too much in stone personally, because things might change or develop differently when you actually start writing the dialogue. But give yourself enough of an idea about dynamics and how they behave and what they think about each other that you've kind of got a starting point, I think, and is a guide that helps to get me going. So I do that on the back of each of the characters' pages, what they think of each other or how they act with each other to begin with. As you write these things, you see conflicts, either big or small, and you might get ideas there about how these conflicts resolve or expand during the plot, how their opinions of each other change, that sort of thing. So that's basically 90% of what I do, I think, planning characters. If there is obviously important backstory stuff, I will jot that down, but it's never normally beyond jottings for me. And I'll start thinking about the character's appearance as well and how they dress. I'll think about any quirks they might have if I've not already written that in the early, messy starting plan. And I think about the ways they speak as well, you know, their typical words in their vocabulary, their ways of addressing people, typical sayings or mannerisms, that sort of thing. If I realise, obviously, later on there's stuff I'll need, I can add it in then. But that's about all I do. I start with rough sprawling ideas, then their opinions on each other and approach, then their appearance, their quirks, and their voice. Yeah, so I don't know if this is of any use to any of you. As I say, it's just my system. Planning, I do think, is very important. I just think if I spent ages doing something like those endless questionnaires about character's favourite food or colour and stuff, it'll either be limiting my general idea and feel of this character down to a checklist, or it'll just be a waste of time on things that are never going to get used anyway. Like, for example, I think if a character's favourite food is important to the story, then I'll have realised that already during the sprawling plan, because there'll be some emotional reason as to why it's important and as to why it came up in my thoughts to begin with. Like, I might have said something about a character being very exact in their nature, and I might have then drawn a line off and write that they only eat whatever favourite food on whatever day because it's their favourite, that's how they are, that sort of thing. So I think either I'll have realised it during that planning stage, or I'll realise it during the writing, and then I can easily just add it in there as I go. You know, first drafts are first drafts. Part of, I think, what's good about a first draft is it gives you time to get to know a character, if that doesn't sound ridiculous. So yeah, there's no reason I can't go back and add that stuff later in, but otherwise I feel like planning out what everybody's favourite food is just wouldn't matter. But let me know what you think anyway. I think I've covered most of what I want to say here. If you like the video, give it a like. If you fancy more, subscribe. If you fancy even more, support me on Patreon. But otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And a special thank you goes to Devin, David Kling, Darren Burdock-Latter, Kestrel, Gay Hitler, Incomplete Sentience, Samara Salsi, Sharikov2814 and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.